Many things that have been labeled high conflict are not mutual conflict. One of the parents is driving the conflict. People often have difficulty in taking the perspective of the other parent or even the children. You can get help with a separation agreement from an attorney, but an attorney isn't thinking about the emotional and relational aspects. When you're a parent, what kind of self do you want to come from, right? What kind of self do you want driving the bus? You want your best self, your strongest self, your bravest self.
All right, I am joined this morning by Al Huntoon, who is a co-parenting specialist. He's the owner of Coparenting Connection in Durham, North Carolina, as well as the author of a book called The Co-Parenting Compass. And Al helps motivated parents to navigate their co-parenting journey effectively. And Al and I connected a little over a year ago on LinkedIn, and I've I've been drawn to you. I read a lot of the stuff that you post. You're one of the leading voices, I would say, on LinkedIn in terms of talking about co-parenting challenges and co-parenting dynamics and what the opportunity is for parents. So, thank you for taking some time to come here and have a conversation with me today.
Well, thanks for inviting me to do so. It's a pleasure to talk with you. The subject is so close to my heart. I appreciate every opportunity to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I know you've got, quite a background in terms of providing support services, not always necessarily co-parenting, and your background is in social work, but was hoping to hear just a couple of minutes of like what brought you to doing this work and working with individuals and couples specifically in this area.
hmm Well, as you said, my background's in social work. I've about 30 plus years of progressive, experience in social work, working with families and children, public health, mental health. I have a lot of experience with training. I did two pretty significant statewide training projects that were over a 2 year period, both of them. So there was some training, there was some coaching in that. Um, Recently, I had a job as a custody mediator for Wake County courts. And I did that for 8.5 years, is high volume, really kind of an assembly line. I mediated over 2,000 cases during that time. So I saw people from every situation you can imagine. Uh, in North Carolina, everyone who has filed a case for custody, a legal case with the courts, is ordered into custody mediation. There's some exceptions. Judges can waive some cases, but by and large, most cases go through mediation. And so, it was every kind of situation imaginable. People, coming after they had a one night stand to people who had been married, 20 plus years. And, and not just people who were married and divorcing. And probably about half of the people had never been married, and many of them never, lived in the same residence. And sometimes there were also, other caregivers, grandparents or family members, and sometimes people were involved in custody who weren't even family members. So it just a huge range. And, so I saw all those situations. I saw the strength that people brought to uh, thinking about a formal arrangement about custody. I saw the mistakes that people made, and I saw, uh, all kinds of approaches to the challenge of setting up a long-term sustainable relationship where children go between two homes, right? Between two parents or two caregivers and two homes. So I retired from that and I did some retirement things, but I realized I kind of left too early. And I thought about what do I still have to offer, and really came up with the co-parenting coaching, some consulting, and as you were saying, a lot of writing. And the writing has helped me really refine my thoughts, and not just that, a framework with an approach and language to high conflict custody situations. And what I've realized, reflecting on my experience and all the writing and researching that I've done, is that many things that have been labeled high conflict are not mutual conflict. One of the parents is driving the conflict, and that's true in all kinds of situations where there is conflict, right? Usually there's one of the parties is has more of an active role in driving the conflict, and that's true co-parenting too. um, so I've really refined that approach. I've created a lot of language around it, and I have a lot of experience helping people in high conflict situations. I also help people in other situations. I help people kind of what I think of it in an early intervention approach where both parents are working through a plan, not just the kinds of formal arrangements that you see in custody orders or parenting plans and separation agreements about when the children are at what household, and how they get there and how holidays are, but a broader, more global approach to the whole issue. Because that pragmatic part that you see in custody orders is only one dimension. There's an emotional and relational dimension that is equally, if not more important, that people aren't going to work through with their attorneys or a judge if they're going through the courtroom, or with a mediator. Um, and and that part has been very rewarding, is helping people anticipate the challenges that they're going to face and plan around that. So kind of two ends of the spectrum. One where people are, thinking it through, they're planning, they're talking, and then the other end where there's a lot of conflict. And how can that conflict be approached and managed and thought about? Not just for parents, but I interact with a lot of professionals around that.
Hmm. In doing these interviews, I'm reminded why I like the people I'm interviewing so much. And I talk a lot about the importance of that emotional and relational work, and how if it's not addressed, and ideally early, it tends to come out in the legal and the financial negotiations, and it makes those conversations much harder, much more stressful, much more costly, and
It
ultimately less
does.
productive. So, as a divorce coach, I'm always thinking about how I can bridge individuals to the support that they most need to be able to get through a divorce journey as amicably as possible, which means that the two of them continue to stay in the driver's seat with the agreements and the decisions that they make.
Mhm.
And so I'm oftentimes at the very start telling people that divorce is really these four conversations. You got the money conversation, parenting custody conversation if you've got children, child support, and alimony. And just by breaking it up, we can start to talk about like which of these conversations feel like they might be challenging for you and your spouse. Like where might
Mhm.
it feel a little bit dicey for the two of you to be able to sit down and hammer out all of the details that need to be hammered out? Because there's oftentimes some discomfort. Maybe one spouse is not trusting of the other spouse anymore and they feel like they're controlling or manipulative, or there's a big education gap, or there's simply just a lack of structure with how do we even start? Like, what do we talk about first? And when I hear that people have some concerns about their ability to get through those conversations, that's my cue to introduce neutral third parties, whether it's a co-parenting coach or a divorce financial analyst or a specific type of therapist or a mediator. Like, that's the opportunity to introduce these other professionals. And so I'm curious, like you've already spoken to a couple of these points, but what are some of the more common challenges or pain points that you see individuals or couples having around co-parenting, where, working with a co-parenting coach can make a tremendous difference?
Well, so many, and there's so much diversity in people's situations. And I think there's kind of a cycle in terms of separation, right? Not necessarily, like I've said, I've seen so many people who were never married. They were in serious committed relationships and they had children, but not married. And they're separating into different households. So that's in the midst of a breakup, right? And people are overwhelmed. They have different styles, I don't want to get too technical, but attachment styles, and that informs the relationship and it informs the breakup, right? And so they can be emotionally overwhelmed. And when people are emotionally overwhelmed, of course, their emotional side is tends to drive the bus. They get up in their feelings, as people say. And so it's important to be able to recognize when people's emotions are driving the bus, so to speak. That's a metaphor I use a lot. That's a skill. It's a skill, and I think it comes up in mediation a lot. Is that are we driving people facilitating kind of a rational decision, which is if custody or divorce goes into court, that's the perspective of the judge. The judge is supposed to be completely objective and rational about it. So there's that framing. But if we completely ignore their emotional overwhelm, we won't be able to get them to access the rational part, right? Their emotions will continue to drive the bus. And so recognizing emotions, helping people with emotional literacy, I think is a key thing at the beginning. And then there's other parts where, they may have been in conflict for a long time. And then the conflict is hardened. And I think that's an important thing to recognize as well, is that once the conflict hardens, it's more difficult to overcome their perspectives. And part of that also has to do with emotional literacy, because what they have difficulty is in perspective taking, right?
Hmm.
People often have difficulty in taking the perspective of the other parent or even the children. And that is what leads to a lot of conflict. People who can empathize, which is another word for uh, perspective taking, it's the emotional aspect of taking the perspective of another person. If they can empathize, they tend to be more cooperative. So those are the kinds of things that I address that I think is different. I really look at the emotional and relational aspects. I try to see where people are in the life cycle, what the typical emotional relational challenges are in the life cycle, and then I move them no matter where they are. My goal as a coach is to move them in a certain direction, and the direction is to be more strategic about what you're doing rather than reactive, and to develop emotional literacy to the extent possible.
Hmm.
Those are the two things that have the most influence on the relation between the dynamic between co-parents.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I see so many parallels, right? Because I catch people at the point of feeling overwhelmed too, whether divorce just fell in their lap or whether they've been agonizing for months trying to make this decision and they finally decided that they are going to move in the direction of separation. Like the number of unanswered questions that bear down on you all at once is part of what creates a lot of that overwhelm. And it's all of this uncertainty. And some of the uncertainty is just, I don't even know how to get through these conversations. We've been in such conflict, we can't really talk. I don't want to go the route of attorneys, so I don't know what to do. And just that spinning really takes a toll on people, like you said. And so, I do like step one in my process is how do we reduce the uncertainty? And where I can provide some like basic education, I will do that. But then oftentimes it's bucketing what are your other unanswered questions? Are they financial in nature, legal in nature? Is it about your housing situation? Or is it about how you continue to interact with your co-parent? And
Mhm.
what happens to your kids and the impact on your kids and the impact on your relationship with your kids. And when I find that there's a fair number of questions that are causing a lot of stress and angst for people that I can't answer as a divorce coach, which is pretty frequent, that's where handing them off to another complementary professional like you is great because you're very comfortable if people show up in a state of overwhelm about what to do with parenting and living arrangements and the kids. They can borrow your nervous system, right, for a while and relax into the structure and the expertise that you have to, like you said, move them in a direction that will be more encompassing of the family and the children and not just the fear of like what comes next for me.
Right. Well, I think you hit a couple of points right on the head. One is that I am comfortable with it. I've having seen so many cases and real extremely difficult cases. And so when people see that you're grounded and you're confident, I think it makes a huge difference for them. They, like you said, they're borrowing your nervous system. The other thing you're talking about, uncertainty. Uncertainty is anchored in fear,
Hmm.
right? And it's natural to be afraid, but some of that has to do with you're afraid your future self won't be able to handle the challenge,
Hmm.
right? You're feeling overwhelmed and you're afraid your future self, you don't trust your future self. You found yourself in a situation you probably never thought you'd be in. You don't like it, and you're second guessing yourself a lot of times to think how come I wasn't able to avoid this, right? So it would be natural that you wouldn't trust your future self. But by surfacing that that whole um, that whole issue for people, I think it helps them to think about that. Like if you can see that your future self will be able to handle some of this, then you can feel more confident right now. Confidence and trust in your future self translates into some trust in your ability right now to do things. And that's something that I help with people with, that I surface. Your anxiety about the uncertainty in the future is fear.
Hmm.
And it has to do with your anticipation of not being able to handle the situation. Just stating it out loud can make a world of difference for people.
Absolutely. And I see the work that a co-parenting coach does as being so important, really kind of right out of the gate, because many people, if they've committed to the direction of divorce or exploring divorce, one of the first things they're doing is separating their living situation. And when they've
Mhm.
got kids, there's all those questions of how are we going to do this? Are we going to nest? Which is something I hear a lot of people talk about. And getting some structure for how to think about what this interim living situation is going to look like. How much interaction do we have? How do we treat our pickups and drop-offs? And what if one partner had an affair, right? And that individual still engaged with the person they had an affair with. Well, now one spouse doesn't want that person in this house that they might be rotating out to. Like, there's so many potential complications that people need to think through. And yet, it's one of the very first things that they're wanting to commit to so that they've got a date of separation and they can get the clock ticking. So, I'm oftentimes mentioning your name and just the benefit of being able to sit down with someone who, again, isn't in the situation. They're not in the conflict and can help people to think more rationally and like medium term about this situation. And is that actually going to work for the family, or how can we make it work best for the family?
Well, I appreciate you mentioning my name to people. That's invaluable. I think, when I see those people who are early in the process, early in the life cycle, um, one of the things is that people can often do is try to offload some of the challenges to an attorney, right? And that can be a good thing, but it can also be a mistake, um, because attorneys approach the whole issue in a much different fashion. You can, if you're separating, you can get help with the separation agreement from an attorney, but an attorney isn't thinking about the emotional and relational aspects, right? They're
Hmm.
thinking about kind of like the pragmatic parts of this. And they often operate from templates, right? They're trying to simplify things as much as possible. And they're thinking from the point of view of court. What would a judge do in this situation, right? Where that's not, I know that's not your approach. That's not my approach at all. It's like what's going to work for the two of you and your children,
Hmm.
especially before there might be something more formally worked out, like a court order or divorce decree or something like that. Um, so I think that's really important. The other thing that you mentioned is, when there's other people involved, it could be, someone had an affair, it could be other relatives, it could be grandparents, things like that. And that definitely complicates things. So it's one of the things is helping people to understand what's in their sphere of control and influence and what's not. And that can be really frustrating for people when they think about, there's another adult who may barely know the children, and all of a sudden they're going to have a caregiving role. And, what can you control about that? What can you influence about it? And what do you need to focus on if you can't do either of those things is really important for people.
So you will have those conversations with individuals because I know there's a lot of emotionality there of realizing that I can't make this person be a certain way, or they seem pretty committed to be in a way that I don't necessarily want my
Right.
kids to be close to. It can feel a lot of powerlessness there, a lot of anger and resentment there. But then that feeds, bad energy and bad fuel into the ongoing co-parenting relationship, which if that degrades, then that will impact the kids. I mean, it's a challenging dynamic, I'm sure.
It is, and people in that one of the things I talk to people about in that situation is you have access to different cells, right? You have access to different parts. Your people internally are very complex, and they can access different parts of themselves. And when they're operating from anger, uh, usually anger is a secondary emotion. It's fear again,
Hmm.
right? Much of our negative emotions are driven by fear. You're afraid that the other parent's going to do something, have more influence or a negative influence or something like that, right? Again, you're not trusting to your influence to help, um, you know, shape your children, help your children grow in a certain way, in a positive way. And so, naming that it has to do with fear, and helping people understand that if they're coming from a place of fear, they're coming from their most vulnerable self.
Mm.
And when you're a parent, what kind of self do you want to come from, right? What kind of self do you want driving the bus? You want your best self, your strongest self, your bravest self. And I think that's another thing that I think if you name that and you talk about when you operate from fear, when fear's driving the bus, you're not being your best self for your children. You have access to part of yourself that is brave and that is strategic. And every parent wants to bring that self to parenting. Um, and I think that can be quite motivational for people.
Yeah. When I can see a lot of value in that too, because when people get caught in a real disempowering narrative, it doesn't necessarily go away with time. Like there's no guarantee, at least, that it goes away with time. And so finding someone that can help you to relate to a challenging dynamic differently can be a wonderful thing. Because again, 2 years later, it may not necessarily be better. 2 years later, you might still be struggling with the same stuff and feeling just as angry, which is challenging. A lot of that bad energy comes at the expense of being present for your kids. And so
Hmm.
oftentimes I have to remind people of that too, that all of this anger that you have towards your spouse is like distracting you and making you less emotionally available for what's actually going on in your family.
Right, right. Yes, that's the kind of thing that I discuss with people is that that is not if you're operating from that self that is motivated by fear and that the fear has expression through, anger, resentment, and grief, then that your children are going to pick that up, right? The other thing I talk about, and coming back to perspective taking, is that what I find is um, parents who have more access to empathy see their children as part of a relational system, right? They don't see themselves as individuals and then their children are somehow separate. They're not that they're enmeshed, but that they're part of the system. And what they see is the other parent is part of the children's relational system, and kind of there's a distributive property. My children are in my relational system, the other parent is in the children's relational system. Therefore, the other parent is in my relational system, right?
Hmm.
And so that makes people more cooperative because they see the benefits for their children. If they don't have access to that, then they see their children as some kind of extension of themselves and the other parent as being totally separate. So they tend to have a more competitive stance. And it's what can be helpful is usually I'm working with the cooperative parent, right?
Hmm.
I'm working with the parent who sees who wants to be in a better relationship with the other co-parent, the more competitive co-parent. And they get frustrated because all of their overtures to cooperation are not received, right? Or they're exploited a lot of times, right? Um, and and so helping them see that there's the other parent is more competitive and transactional. And if your expectations are set realistically about that, you're not going to get the cooperation that you want, but you also won't get the frustration of feeling like you're from trying to draw the other parent into more of a cooperative relationship.
Hmm. Yeah, so I'm hearing that there's some real tactical work that you can help people with, things like parenting plans and talking through different ideas for their living arrangement, whether it's in separation or afterwards. But then there's also like the actual work of co-parenting, right? Like what does this feel like on a daily, weekly basis? How do I continue to engage with my kids and my co-parent as these types of things come up? And just some real coaching support for that relational and again emotional dimension to divorce and living as two households.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's the difference between the map and the terrain. And like I've not only written hundreds of parenting plans of court orders in the court system in North Carolina. The mediators write up parenting plans. The parents, and if they have attorneys, the attorneys review them. And then if the parents sign them, they go to a judge, the judge reviews them. The judge signs them, become a court order, right? So I've written more custody orders probably than any attorney in North Carolina. It's not an exaggeration. There are hundreds of them. And I've also seen hundreds written by attorneys and judges, right? So in terms of a map, it can be a very basic map, like a map someone would draw on a napkin. Here's how you get to my house, or it can be quite detailed, but there's still maps. The real um, the real challenge comes in navigating the terrain. Okay, and that's something I can help people with plans. I can help people draw a map to get to where they want to go. But there's much more value in helping people navigate the terrain, especially if the terrain is really rough.
Yeah. So maybe you can tell us just a little bit more about parenting plans, because I do talk to a fair number of individuals who feel confident in their ability that they and their spouse can sit down and figure out all the details of their separation. And they might be thinking of custody as, well, we agree to 50-50 and we both want to be able to be there for holidays and birthdays. But that's kind of the end of their thought, right? Like we want to be fair, we're both invested, but it doesn't paint in a lot of the detail. Whereas someone with the experience that you have of like seeing so many thousands of people in situations, seeing what happens that people didn't anticipate, after that initial conversation, like what do you bring to a conversation where two individuals are trying to hammer out a parenting plan versus what they might do simply on their own?
Well, I'll be upfront about that. I haven't helped a lot of people in terms of a formal parenting plan.
Hmm.
I know I'm intimately familiar and I can talk about it. If you want a good parenting plan that would go in a separation agreement or a custody order, there's really two parts that are necessary. And the first part is how you make decisions for your children, important, consequential decisions, educational decisions, what school are they going to attend, medical decisions, and it could be religious or spiritual decisions. For some people, that's important. What church are they going to attend, if they attend church or not, or the people could come from different religions. Are they going to be raised in one religion or another? Are they going
Hmm.
to get intensive religious instruction in some cases or not? So those are the big things. People often mistake that for kind of other things, but those are the major categories. Medical, dental, includes mental health therapy is regarded as a treatment, and then the educational, spiritual, religious decisions, and then there's time, right? And people think of it, when is my child going to spend time with me? But the real correct way to think about it is, when am I responsible for my
Mm.
child? Okay. Because that opens up another dimension, which is day-to-day decisions. Are they going to have, uh, are we going to have a bran muffin for breakfast? Or are we going to have Lucky Charms for breakfast? That's not a major decision. It's a day-to-day decision. Are, are they going to get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, for lunch, or am I going to buy a school lunch? A lot of things like that, they're minor. Is it, oh, they, feel sick? Am I going to keep them home from school, or is it iffy? That can go to a lot of different levels, but that's where the responsibility part comes in. It's not just time, it's responsibility. And then time gets divided up in different ways, the kind of day to day, week to week, month to month. There's a lot of variety in that. And then there's, holidays and vacations and summer, things like that. So those are the two major things. And the more detail people can think about it, if they're just working informally or working up to something more formal, the better they're going to be. Um, those things are, in the court system, um, they're they're referred to in certain ways, but that's what it breaks down to, the decisions and the time. And then there can be more things in there that help people think through special circumstances. And I don't want to get into that too much. But a lot of times people come in and like, oh, we just, to mediation, we just want 50-50, just, we'll share decisions. And can you just write down that? And I would resist that. And especially when it comes to holidays, like Christmas is most people's biggest holiday, is how they're going to spend Christmas. And they would just, I will split it. What I would tell them is that having detail in that kind of plan, having thought it through, is like insurance. And I didn't think I needed homeowners insurance until my house got struck by lightning, which actually happened. Or I didn't think I necessarily needed car insurance because I wasn't planning to get into an accident until somebody hit my car from behind. I stopped at a stoplight a couple years ago, and somebody rammed into my car from behind. So you're not planning on things, accidents or special things kind of coming up that you haven't thought about, but it's worth thinking it through so that you know, you come up with a situation for Christmas or school or whatever it happens to be. You've given it some thought, you've got some guidance. Not that you can't change things in the moment if you both agree, but you've got a framework where you don't have to necessarily kind of come up with something in the moment. So that's, I think, the important thing people need to know about parenting plans or parenting agreements or custody orders, things
Yeah.
like that.
I mean, I love that reframe of when are you responsible for your child, right? That it's a very different question than when do I get time with my child. And I can see a lot of value, again, in having a neutral third party ask some of these questions for the sake of clarity, because many people are still uncomfortable with conflict. And so I may want clarity, but I may not ask if I think it's going to ruffle your feathers. And
Mhm.
so, because I feel like the conversation's going good and I don't want to jeopardize that, or for any of another 100 reasons, I don't ask the clarifying questions that I might need and want moving forward. Whereas a neutral third party's, again, that's part of their job. It's like, let's get some real good clarity here so that you guys know exactly what you're working with coming out on the other end, and it doesn't have that same emotional charge. So again, whether it's people navigating co-parenting conversations or financial conversations or what to do with the business, having a neutral third party can really just get more on the table, which I think benefits everyone long term as they have to live now with whatever this agreement is.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, like back to the terrain, it's unexplored territory for most people. Not
Yeah.
everybody, but most people, it's unexplored territory. So there is sometimes a comfort level that people are in a difficult situation and they don't want to rock the boat. But there's also, just a lack of knowledge about what to expect. It's outside their experience. That's why it's so important to have somebody who really has a lot of experience with this, not just a certificate,
Yeah.
and not just lived experience. A lot of people out there have lived experience. I think that's really important in being able to identify and validate people's experience. But it's not the same thing as being able to anticipate a wide range of issues and challenges. Like you had mentioned nesting, and as you know, I worked with some clients on a nesting agreement, and one of the things that they were very complimentary on is that I helped them think through a bunch of situations which they did not anticipate at all.
Hmm.
And people don't realize that nesting it, it may seem simple, but in a lot of ways it complicates things. People living in the same space after they decided to end their partnership, their relationship, and only relate as parents. And it can be very difficult for people. I've seen it a couple times where it's gone wrong, very wrong. And one of the ways that it goes wrong is people don't think about their exit strategy. They think about the immediate future in nesting, how it's going to work. But that time and time again, when I mediated with people who had nested, they weren't thinking about what the exit strategy would look like and how that was going to get triggered. Was it a certain amount of time passed? But what if one of the parents was extremely dissatisfied with the arrangement? What were they going to do? Uh,
Mm.
so I think that's something that people, someone with experience can anticipate, and that was really valuable for the clients who recently worked with.
Yeah. So, as we start to land the plane here on this conversation, which has been great, maybe you can share a little bit more about what it actually looks like to work with you and what some of the situations people may find themselves in that represent a good time to reach out either for support or at least to explore what support might offer.
Well, I'm glad you asked this because what I do is I have an initial session with people that I call a discovery session, and that's a free consultation with them. And this happened with somebody recently, and some people actually get enough from this. consultation where they don't feel they need to continue to work with me, um, which is I'm amazed. I'm very happy about to help people in that way. And the dad that I worked with was kind of amazed that in a little over an hour we were able to work through his specific challenge in a way that he felt more comfortable, more confident moving forward. Um, who knows? He may reach out in the future again. But so that's how I start out. And when I have the discovery session, one of the things I'm looking for is it a good fit? And I'm not a good fit with everybody. I'm a coach. I'm not a therapist. I
Hmm.
don't know if you've ever played sports, James, or had a coach in another kind of aspect of your life. But I did play some sports growing up. It was a long time ago, and my kids played sports. And the coach was not, okay. A lot of handhold. My coaches pushed me. My kids' coaches pushed me. Um, even, in other aspects, music lessons, they'll push people. I push people and I name uh, comfortable truths as I see them. And I'm blunt and I'm direct and I'm transparent and I challenge people. So I want people to know that.
Hmm.
It, and so that's how I work with people. But I'm very, I'm, I do that because I'm trying to help people gain insight into their own situation and why they're having the reactions that they're having and how they can get to a better place in terms of a better strategy with their co-parent and more emotional literacy, more emotional intelligence. And that's not easy for people. You have to really call them out quite a bit.
Yeah.
So that's how I work with people. People I work with, they tend to really respond very well to that. And what it also means is that for sometimes, like I was just talking about, in the mediation, I learned with kind of a quick and dirty approach, which is to be blunt, to name things, to say what I see, I'm observing, and let the person, the client, react to it, and they can tell me I'm wrong if they think so. Uh, in terms of the situation, like I said, I generally work with people in two different kinds of situations. The most common situation is things are going wrong, right? And one is where there's high conflict, and that's really difficult. And I'll be honest, that doesn't always work for people. Usually in a high conflict situation, as I said, one of the parents is more taking more of a cooperative approach, and the other parent is taking a more competitive or controlling approach.
Hmm.
And that will be part of my assessment, is I will name that dynamic. And so that I do work with people, and I've gotten a few referrals from attorneys, one parenting coordinator to work with people in very high conflict situation. One of the things I did was the referral from the parenting coordinator is we came up with a 2 pages of ground rules for how the parents were going to interact. And every one of those ground rules was mutually agreed upon. And so they went from a situation where it was kind of open and both parents were not interacting in a healthy manner, but one in particular, it went from that to having a lot of common sense rules around the interaction. So in high conflict, that's the kind of thing I look for. Um, and then there's individual parents who I work with in high conflict situations, and that's again about coming up with a strategy that works, being emotionally literate, being your best self for your children. Then the other situation is that, people coming to the process pretty early on in the life cycle. I think of it as early intervention,
Hmm.
and that's very satisfying for me. Then they're anticipating that they're going to be going down some, rocky roads, and how can they plan for that? How can, not just have something on paper, but have some shared expectations about how they're going to interact as co-parents. There tends to be not much in the middle between people being proactive and people being in high conflict situations.
Hmm.
Um, I think the other dynamics are more manageable for people and they can get through them. They don't feel like they need as much support in those situations.
Right. Well, that was great. And if people do want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Well, they can email me, coparentingconnection@gmail.com. Uh, they can go to my website. There's a co-parenting quiz on my website they can take. Uh, there's a contact page on my website. I think going to my website is a good place to kind of get an introduction to what I do. Um, and that's coparentingconnection.com. So either of those methods are a good way to connect with me. I also want to mention, you mentioned my book, which I appreciate, but I also came out with another book, Your Co-Parenting Co-Pilot, which is how to use AI in co-parenting situations. And one of my very first clients talked about using AI to help with emails with this other co-parent in a kind of a high conflict situation. And I kind of had a negative reaction. I wasn't really too familiar at that point. And I thought, well, that's what I do. I'll help you, draft an email. But it got me thinking, and the more I thought about it, and the more I explored it, and the more talked to other people and some of my clients, the more I realized there's a real potential for a tool there that is free and easy to access. So the book's on Amazon and some other places. It's pretty inexpensive, and it runs through a lot of scenarios that I've gotten some really good reviews from clients and professionals, custody evaluators, and parenting coordinators in particular have given me some really good feedback about the book. So
That's
um,
terrific. I didn't know. I'll link to all of that stuff in the description below, and I'll also add that people can follow you on LinkedIn as well, since
yeah.
you're active there pretty much on a daily basis. They can get a sense of your writing and, again, your approach to this type of work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And now there's a lot of resource. I'm pretty generous, I think,
Yeah.
putting stuff out there and pretty in-depth stuff, 5-page articles almost on a weekly basis about, very challenging co-parenting dynamics. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Al. This was a pleasure, and I think you provided a lot of value again, even in this interview.
Well, thank you, James. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm very grateful for it.
Excellent.